There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room right after someone you love says something they can never take back. It isn't silence, exactly. Silence is empty. This was full of a birthday cake nobody was going to eat, full of my granddaughter's small face trying to understand what she'd just watched happen, full of 37 years of being somebody's father collapsing into a single sentence. My son stood at the head of his own dining table, phone already halfway to his ear, and told me I wasn't fit to be his father. Not, "You're not fit to make decisions." Not, "You're not well." He said father, like the word itself was the accusation. I want to tell you that I said something back. Something sharp, something that would have made this a different kind of story, the kind where the wronged man gets his moment, raises his voice, and everyone at the table finally sees him for who he really is. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, and slower, and it took the better part of a year to finish unfolding. But it did finish. And by the end of it, my son wasn't the one holding the phone anymore. This is the story of how a birthday dinner turned into a guardianship filing, how a bridge I built 30 years ago ended up saving me, and how I learned that the difference between weakness and restraint is that one of them is waiting to explode, and the other one is just waiting. Let me back up. You need to understand who I was before you understand what I became to him. 6 months before that birthday, I was 63 years old and living alone in a 2-bedroom rambler on the east side of Tacoma, Washington, 3 blocks up from Puget Gulch, in a neighborhood where half the houses still had the same families in them that had bought them in the 80s. I'd been a structural engineer for 31 years, specializing in bridge design for the Washington State Department of Transportation, and I'd been retired from full-time work for 2 of those years. My wife, Carol, had died 3 years before that, pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end, and the house had a stillness to it I'd mostly made peace with. My mornings were small and specific, the way mornings get when you've lived alone long enough to stop performing them for anyone. Coffee at 6:15, black, in a mug Carol had bought at a craft fair in Leavenworth that said world's okayest engineer. A walk down to the community garden plot I'd kept since Carol got too sick to keep hers, where I grew dahlias in her memory. Café au lait mostly, the big pale ones she'd loved, the ones that looked like they were made of tissue paper and stubbornness. Twice a week I played chess with my neighbor Hal Grunwald, 81 years old, a retired Boeing machinist who beat me maybe 1 game in 4 and never let me forget the ones he won. And once or twice a month, quietly, without telling anyone, I still consulted. WashDOT kept a small roster of retired forensic engineers for structural assessments, bridges, overpasses, the occasional parking garage, and they called me in when something needed a second set of eyes that didn't come from a 26-year-old fresh out of a certification course. I didn't advertise it. It wasn't about the money, though the money was fine. It was about still being useful to something. Carol used to say I loved bridges because they were the one thing in my life that never talked back. She wasn't entirely wrong. My son Derek was 37, a commercial real estate broker in Seattle, married to a wonderful woman named Priya, who ran a physical therapy practice, and the father of my only grandchild, a 7-year-old named Nora with Carol's exact laugh, which undid me every single time I heard it. Derek had grown up watching me build things. Literally, science fair trusses at the kitchen table, actual balsa wood and glue, the 2 of us up past his bedtime because I couldn't stand to leave a joint unfinished. He used to tell people his dad built bridges. He said it like it meant something. Somewhere in the last 5 or 6 years, that had changed. I don't think I can point to one specific day it started, but I can point to the moments that told me it had. The first one was small enough that I almost let it go entirely. It was a Thanksgiving, 2 years after Carol passed, and I'd offered to bring my truss and cable centerpiece, a little scale model of the old Narrows Bridge, the kind of thing that would have made Carol laugh and made Derek, as a kid, beg me to explain the counterweights one more time. I set it on the table between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce, and Priya's father, a kind man named Gerald, asked me a genuine question about the cable tension. Derek cut in before I could answer. "Dad, nobody wants the engineering lecture at dinner." He laughed when he said it, the kind of laugh that's supposed to make the sting sound like affection. A few people at the table chuckled along, the way you do when you're not sure if it's a joke or not, and you decide to be safe about it. I moved the centerpiece to the side table after that. I told myself it was thoughtful of me. It didn't feel thoughtful. It felt like folding. The second one came the following spring, at Nora's kindergarten graduation. A small thing, paper caps and a song about the alphabet. 30 families crammed into a church basement with bad folding chairs. I'd gotten there early to save seats. When Derek and Priya arrived with Priya's parents, Derek scanned the row, saw me sitting there with 2 empty chairs beside me, and said, loud enough for the row behind us to hear, "Dad, you probably want to sit toward the back. Better sight lines for the aisle." There was no better sight line. I sat in the back row alone and watched my granddaughter cross a stage 40 feet away, straining to see past the heads in front of me, while Derek sat up front between Priya's parents like I'd never been offered a seat at all. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight over folding chairs. The third one had teeth in it. It was the following Christmas at Derek and Priya's house in Kirkland, a house I should say was beautiful. He'd done well for himself, and I was proud of that, genuinely. And I'd brought up, gently, the idea of helping with Nora's college fund. I'd set aside money for it years back, before Carol got sick, a 529 account I'd been quietly topping off. I mentioned it over coffee, just an offer, nothing more. Derek didn't even look up from his phone. "We've got it handled, Dad. You don't need to worry about that kind of thing anymore." That kind of thing. Like providing for my own granddaughter had become a hobby I was too old to be trusted with, like a woodworking project someone gently takes the saw away from. Priya, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. Nora, 6 years old at the time, tugged my sleeve and asked me to help her build a Lego castle instead, and I was grateful for the excuse to leave the room. The fourth one, the one that should have told me something bigger was coming, happened about 4 months before the birthday. Derek's brokerage had a rough stretch that spring. I heard about it secondhand, through Priya, who mentioned in passing that they'd had a scary few months with the business, that a couple of big commercial deals had fallen through, that there'd been talk of Derek having to lay off his 2 junior brokers. I called Derek directly and offered, carefully, the way you offer help to a proud man, to look at the numbers with him, or just to talk it through. "I don't need help running my business, Dad," he said, and there was an edge in it I hadn't heard before, something closer to anger than dismissal. "I'm not you. I don't need everything to be a bridge inspection. I let it go." Again. I told myself he was under pressure, that pride does strange things to a man in his late 30s trying to prove he doesn't need his father anymore, and that the kindest thing I could do was stop offering and start waiting. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for months, was that Derek's business hadn't recovered on its own. It had recovered because of something I'd already quietly set in motion months before that phone call, without telling him. But I'm getting ahead of the story. My 64th birthday fell on a Saturday in October. Derek offered to host. The first time in 3 years he'd offered instead of me having to ask, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed by how much that small gesture meant to me. Priya made a lemon cake because she remembered it was my favorite, which touched me more than I let on. Nora made me a card with a crayon drawing of what she told me was the bridge Grandpa built, a wobbly rainbow arc over a blue scribble river, and I taped it to the refrigerator in my mind before I'd even left their driveway. For the first hour, it was good. It was, in fact, one of the best evenings I'd had since Carol died. Derek telling stories from his childhood, Nora falling asleep for a minute against my arm on the couch before rallying for cake, Priya's parents asking me real questions about the Old Narrows project and actually listening to the answers this time. I let myself believe, for that hour, that whatever had been growing cold between Derek and me over the last few years was starting to thaw. Then Gerald, Priya's father, meaning well, God love him, brought up something he'd seen on the local news. A pedestrian bridge over the Puyallup River, one I'd helped design back in the early 90s, had been flagged for a structural review after a maintenance crew found hairline cracking near one of the deck joints. Gerald asked if I'd heard about it. I had. In fact, WashDOT had called me in 11 days earlier to do the informal assessment myself, before they committed to a full closure and a formal inspection contract. I'd spent 4 mornings out there with a flashlight, a crack comparator gauge, and a folding stool, checking hairline fractures against 30-year-old stress calculations I still had memorized better than I had any right to. I told Gerald, honestly and without much drama, that I'd been the one out there. Derek's face changed. Not immediately. It took a second, like something catching up to him. Wait, he said. You've been going out to the bridge? By yourself? Nobody told me that. It's consulting work, Derek. WashDOT calls me a few times a year. You didn't think that was worth mentioning? A man your age, standing on a bridge deck with cracks in it, alone? I told him it wasn't dangerous, that I'd done hundreds of these assessments over 3 decades, that I knew exactly what I was looking at and exactly where not to stand. I told him I hadn't mentioned it because it hadn't seemed like news. I'd been doing this kind of work quietly for 2 years, and it had simply never come up. That was the wrong answer, or maybe there wasn't a right one. Derek stood up from the table. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud yet, but it had a hardness in it I'd never heard directed at me before. Priya's cousin's dad has dementia, he said. It started exactly like this. Little things he didn't think were worth mentioning. Wandering off to places he used to know, thinking he still had a job to do there. Derek, I'm not confused. I know exactly what I'm doing. That's what he said too. Nora, sitting between us with a fork of lemon cake halfway to her mouth, looked up at her father and then at me, her small face doing that thing children's faces do when they're trying to read a room they don't have the tools to read yet. Derek, Priya said quietly, a warning in it. He didn't stop. He pulled out his phone right there at the table, my birthday cake still sitting half-eaten in front of me, 7 candles from a leftover box, because Priya couldn't find 64 of them, Nora's crayon card still folded in my jacket pocket, and he said the sentence I don't think I'll ever fully stop hearing. I've already talked to an attorney, Dad. Marlene say, she does elder law. We're filing for a cognitive evaluation and, depending what it shows, guardianship. I should have done it months ago. He looked at me, and for 1 second I saw something underneath the anger that looked almost like fear. You're not fit to be my father right now. You need someone making decisions for you before you get hurt, or before you hurt somebody else. And then, before I could answer, before anyone at that table could say a word, he dialed. It was Nora who broke the silence, not me. She tugged my sleeve the way she had at Christmas, and in a small voice, not understanding the legal weight of what she'd just heard, only understanding that something was badly wrong, she asked, Grandpa, are you going to forget who I am? I want you to sit with that question for a second, because I had to. A 7-year-old, asking her grandfather if he was going to forget her, on the same night her father had just announced, phone in hand, that he no longer trusted him with his own life. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't grab the phone out of his hand, though God knows some old animal part of me wanted to. I didn't call him ungrateful, though the word sat on my tongue for a long moment. I didn't tell him about the money. Not then, not with Nora watching, not with Priya's parents sitting there in stunned silence over a lemon cake gone cold. I stood up, slowly, the way you stand up when your knees remind you that you're 64 and not 40. I looked at Derek, who had, to his credit, at least lowered the phone from his ear when he saw my face, and I said, I'm going to let you make that call somewhere private, and I'm going to go home. Dad, happy birthday to me, I said. Not bitter. Just true. And then I knelt down in front of Nora, who had tears standing in her eyes now, and I told her the only thing I knew for certain was true. I could never forget you, sweetheart. Not ever. Not for anything in the whole world. I kissed the top of her head, thanked Priya for the cake, and I drove myself home. Derek, from what Priya told me weeks later, did not handle the rest of that evening quietly. He called the attorney back within the hour, agitated, talking too fast, half convinced he'd need to file an emergency petition. He didn't sleep. He called his sister-in-law, who is a nurse, and described my behavior in terms that made it sound far more alarming than 4 mornings on a bridge deck with a flashlight. By the time I got a formal letter from Marlene Say's office 9 days later, notifying me that a petition for guardianship evaluation had been filed in Pierce County Superior Court, and that I'd be required to undergo a court-ordered cognitive assessment, Derek had already told 3 separate family members that his father was declining, and that he was handling it. I read that letter twice at my kitchen table, Carol's World's okayest engineer mug in front of me, and I noticed something about myself that I want to tell you honestly, because I think it matters. My hands weren't shaking. My first instinct wasn't rage. It was something closer to grief, a specific, clean grief, for the version of Derek who used to sit at that same table with balsa wood glue on his fingers, asking me to explain load distribution one more time. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about why I didn't fight fire with fire that night. Part of it, I think, is that I'd already lived through the kind of loss that makes you understand what actually matters and what doesn't. Carol dying taught me that grief and anger burn the same fuel, and you only get so much of it before you're running on fumes. I didn't want to spend what I had left on a shouting match at my own birthday table. But there was something else too, something I only understood clearly later. Restraint isn't the absence of a fight. It's choosing your ground. A man who explodes gives everyone in the room permission to write him off as the problem. A man who stays steady forces them to eventually look at the facts instead. I didn't know, that night, exactly how the facts were going to save me. I only knew that I had them, and that losing my composure was the one thing that could bury them. Here is the part of the story Derek didn't know. Here is the part almost nobody knew. 2 years earlier, when Derek's brokerage had its first bad quarter, before the scary few months Priya had mentioned in passing, before the layoffs that never happened, Derek had come to me, once, in a rare unguarded moment, and admitted he was underwater on a business line of credit. $41,000, a number he said out loud like it was choking him. He'd asked me not to tell Priya how bad it had gotten. He was ashamed, and pride is a strange animal in a man who's spent his whole life trying to prove he didn't need his father's help. I didn't lecture him. I didn't offer him a check with my name on the memo line, because I understood, even then, that a check from Dad would have felt to him like a verdict on everything he'd tried to build. Instead, I went to a lawyer of my own, an old friend from Carol's church group, a woman named Rosalind Achabe, who specialized in small business structuring, and we set up a private lending arrangement through a blind LLC, Cascade Fielding Partners, that existed for exactly one purpose: to purchase and quietly service Derek's business debt at better terms than the bank had given him, without his name ever touching mine on a single document. I funded it with part of the life insurance settlement from Carol's passing, money I'd never planned to spend on myself, and a little from the 529 account I'd since redirected once Derek made clear he didn't want my help with Nora's college fund. It came out to $58,000 over 2 years, paid down steadily, quietly, invisibly, every single month. Derek believed, to this day, that his brokerage had turned itself around because he'd renegotiated with a more flexible lender. He had no idea the more flexible lender was his father, sitting 3 blocks from Puget Gulch, growing dahlias and playing chess with a retired machinist, saying nothing about it to anyone. I want to be honest with you about why I never told him. Part of it was pride of my own. I liked the idea of protecting him without him ever having to feel protected. But if I'm honest, a bigger part of it was fear. I was afraid that if I told him, he'd feel smaller instead of grateful, that it would confirm every insecurity he'd apparently been carrying about living in his father's shadow. I thought silence was kindness. I was wrong about that, as it turned out, not because the help wasn't real, but because silence, held too long, starts to look like a secret, and secrets, once discovered, don't read as generosity. They read as control. I also kept records. Meticulous ones. The engineer in me never really clocks out. Every wire transfer, every LLC filing, every servicing statement, every letter from Rosalind's office, filed chronologically in a fireproof lockbox in my hall closet, along with the WashDOT consulting contracts, the crack comparator readings from the Puyallup Bridge, the emails confirming every single one of my wandering trips out there had been scheduled, authorized, and documented by a state engineer named Priyanka Osei. No relation to Derek's attorney, a coincidence that would matter later, only because it briefly confused everyone in the room. I hadn't kept those records because I expected to need them in a courtroom. I'd kept them because 31 years of engineering teaches you that undocumented work is work nobody can trust, including you. 10 years later, trying to remember what you actually did. It turned out to be the most important habit of my life. The court-ordered evaluation happened on a Tuesday morning in late November at a geriatric assessment clinic in Tacoma, conducted by a neuropsychologist named Dr. Feliza Marsh, appointed by the court and, crucially, paid for by the petition Derek had filed, meaning she had no obligation to either of us, no reason to find anything other than what was actually there. I'll spare you the full 3 hours of testing. Word recall, clock drawing, digit span backward, a long verbal fluency section where I had to name as many animals as I could in 60 seconds and blanked, humiliatingly, on the word otter, until 40 seconds in, which I remained mildly annoyed about. Dr. Marsh was calm and unhurried and asked me, at one point, almost conversationally, why I thought my son had filed the petition. He's scared, I told her. He thinks he's protecting me. I think, underneath that, he's scared of something that has nothing to do with me at all. She wrote something down. She didn't tell me what. 2 weeks later, her report came back. My cognitive function, she wrote, was entirely within normal range for my age, with no indicators of dementia, mild cognitive impairment, or any condition that would compromise my capacity to manage my own affairs. She noted, with what I can only describe as professional understatement, that the referral appeared to have been prompted by third-party concern regarding independent professional activity, rather than by observed cognitive symptoms. Marlene Osei, Derek's attorney, called a meeting. Not a hearing, not yet, just to sit down at her office in downtown Tacoma, with Derek present, to review the findings before deciding whether to proceed. I brought my own attorney, a sharp, unhurried man named Desmond Yarrow who Rosalind had recommended, and I brought the lockbox. I remember the exact moment the room's temperature changed. Marlene had Dr. Marsh's report open on the table, and she was walking through it calmly, professionally, the way a good attorney does when the evidence isn't going the way her client hoped. Derek sat across from me, arms crossed, jaw tight, still not looking directly at me. There's also the matter of the Puyallup Bridge visits, Marlene said, mostly for the record. I understand there's a washed-out consulting relationship. I slid the folder across the table. Contracts. Authorization emails from Priyanka Osei at the state level, timestamped, official. A letter from the district engineer thanking me by name for catching a joint deficiency that would have cost the state considerably more to find later. Derek looked at it for a long moment. I watched something in his face come apart, slowly, like watching a crack propagate through concrete you already knew was compromised. You can see it happening, and you still can't stop it. You've been doing actual work out there, he said, quiet. This whole time. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I did, I said, and I kept my voice level, though it cost me something to do it. At my birthday dinner, you called a lawyer instead of asking me a follow-up question. He didn't have an answer for that. Desmond, beside me, let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to. Then I nodded to him, and he opened the second folder. I want to describe Derek's face when Desmond laid out the Cascade Fielding Partners documents, because I've thought about it more times than I can count since. It wasn't anger this time. It was something closer to the look Nora gets when a tower of blocks she's built falls over, and she can't immediately understand why. Confusion first, then the slow, sinking arrival of an answer she didn't want. Desmond walked through it plainly, without drama, the way I'd asked him to. The LLC formation date. The debt purchase agreement. 24 months of servicing statements showing Derek's business line of credit paid down from $41,000 to zero, at better terms than any bank in the state would have offered a small brokerage with 2 rocky quarters on the books. Rosalind's retainer letter. My own bank statements. The withdrawals lining up month after month against the LLC's incoming transfers, dollar for dollar. Your father structured this specifically so you wouldn't know it was him, Desmond said, and I remember he didn't look at Derek when he said it. He looked at Marlene, attorney to attorney, letting the fact speak for itself instead of aiming it like a weapon. There's no ambiguity here. This isn't a loan he's calling in. It was never structured to be repaid to him personally, or claimed against your estate, or used as leverage in any proceeding. He did it so your business would survive and you'd never have to know where the help came from. Derek didn't say anything for a long time. Marlene, to her credit, was quiet too. A good attorney knows when the facts have finished the argument for her. Finally, Derek looked up at me. $58,000, he said. Not a question, just the number, out loud, like he needed to hear it in his own voice to believe it belonged to him. You needed it, I said. I had it. That's all it was ever supposed to be. You let me think I fixed it myself. You did fix it. I just made the terms survivable. I meant that. I still mean it. He'd renegotiated his vendor contracts, cut 2 subscriptions he didn't need, rebuilt his client pipeline almost entirely from referrals through sheer persistence. The debt relief gave him room to do the actual work. I'd never once thought of it as me fixing his business for him. Marlene closed her folder. Given the evaluation and this documentation, she said, carefully, professionally, to Derek rather than to me, I'd strongly advise against proceeding with the petition. There's no legal basis here. I'd also gently suggest this might be a conversation to have outside this office. Derek didn't argue with her. He sat there, hands flat on the table, and for the first time since the birthday party, he looked at me like he was actually seeing me, instead of seeing whatever fear had been standing in front of me all these months. He apologized in Marlene's parking lot, of all places, standing next to my truck in a cold Tacoma drizzle, hands jammed in his coat pockets. It wasn't a clean apology. Real ones rarely are. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said. I know how that sounds now. I wasn't. I believe you, I said, and I did. Gerald's cousin, the one with the dementia, I watched that whole thing happen over 2 years. Watched him wander off and not remember why. I think I saw you out at that bridge and he stopped. Started again. I think I've spent my whole life scared that someday I'd have to be the strong one instead of you. And I decided the day that started was today, whether it needed to or not. I made you into the emergency instead of asking you what was actually going on. You could have asked. I know. His voice cracked a little on that. And I want to tell you, I felt some flicker of vindication, some quiet satisfaction at watching him arrive at that truth on his own. Mostly what I felt was tired and sad, and something like hope, all three at once, the way grief and relief sometimes share a body. And the business, he said. You let me believe, I know what I let you believe. That's on me too. I thought I was protecting you from feeling small. I think, now, it just made you feel managed instead. I'm sorry for that part. He nodded slowly. Neither of us hugged it out in that parking lot. That's not who either of us is, and frankly, I think it would have felt false. A scene borrowed from somewhere else instead of earned in the place we actually were. What we did instead was agree, tentatively, to have dinner the following Sunday, just the two of us, without Priya or Nora there to referee. It felt like a small thing. It was, in fact, the beginning of the actual work. I won't pretend the months after that were smooth. Trust, once it's cracked, doesn't set back to zero just because the crack's been located and the load recalculated. Anyone in my old line of work could tell you that. You reinforce it. You watch it. Sometimes you find out the crack runs deeper than the first inspection showed. That first Sunday dinner was stilted, full of long pauses, both of us reaching for a normal that wasn't quite available to us yet. Derek asked, hesitantly, about the Puyallup Bridge repair, and I found myself talking for 20 straight minutes about deck joints and expansion tolerances before I caught myself and apologized for the lecture. He told me, quietly, that he didn't mind. That he'd missed it, actually, without knowing he'd missed it until it was back in front of him. Around the 4th or 5th Sunday, I set a boundary with him, and I want to tell you I did it plainly, because I think that part matters as much as anything else in this story. I told him that I loved him, that I understood the fear that had driven the guardianship filing even if I still carried some hurt from it, and that I needed him to know something clearly. If he ever had a concern about me again, my health, my judgment, anything, the first call needed to be to me, not to an attorney. That a filing could happen after a conversation, if the conversation genuinely warranted it, but never instead of one. He didn't argue. He said, okay, that's fair. And he's kept it, as far as I can tell, in the year and a half since. Around February, Priya invited me over for a Sunday that included Nora, the first time since the birthday dinner that the two of us had been in a room together without the whole extended family cushioning it. I brought something with me I hadn't looked at in almost a decade, a wooden truss bridge model Derek and I had built together for his 6th grade science fair, 31 years ago, back when he still thought his father's job was the most interesting thing in the world. It had sat in a box in my garage for years. One of its main support beams snapped clean through, ever since a bad night when Derek was 17 and furious about something else entirely. A curfew, a girl, I don't even remember now, and had thrown it across his bedroom in a rage he apologized for the next morning and neither of us ever mentioned again. I set it on Priya's kitchen table, cracked beam and all, and Derek stared at it for a long moment before he understood what he was looking at. You kept it, he said. Even after I broke it. I kept everything. I told him, and I meant the model, and I meant the records in the lockbox, and I think, on some level, I meant him too. We fixed it together that afternoon, at Priya's kitchen table, the same way we'd built it in the first place. Him holding the beam steady, me working the glue into the joint with a toothpick because that's how his 6th grade self had insisted on doing it. Both of us laughing about how bad the original paint job had been. Nora sat on a stool watching the whole thing with the serious focus only a 7-year-old can bring to somebody else's project, and at the end, when the glue had set and the little truss bridge stood upright again on the table, she asked if she could paint the new beam a different color, so you could always tell it had been broken and fixed. Derek and I both told her that was exactly right. That's exactly what it should look like. By that summer, Derek had started calling me, unprompted, when the brokerage hit a rough patch on a deal, not asking me to fix anything, just asking me to talk it through, the way I'd offered years before and been turned away. He told Nora, once, within earshot of me, that her grandfather had spent his whole career keeping bridges from falling down, and that some people never find out how strong a thing is until it's tested. I don't think he knew I heard him say it. I've held on to it since, the way you hold on to the good readings after a long inspection, proof that the structure, cracked as it had been, was still sound where it counted. I think about that birthday dinner often, still, the cake going cold, my granddaughter's small voice asking if I was going to forget her, my son with a phone already halfway to his ear. I don't think Derek was cruel that night. I think he was afraid, and fear, in people who love each other, has a way of dressing itself up as certainty and marching straight past the one conversation that would have solved everything. I could have met his fear with anger of my own. I've watched other families do exactly that, watched them turn a misunderstanding into an unbridgeable canyon, because nobody was willing to be the calm one first. I chose, instead, to let the facts do what facts do when you give them room and time. Hold their shape, under pressure, the way a well-built structure is supposed to. If you're watching this because someone in your family has decided who you are before they asked you, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to prove yourself by shouting. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay steady long enough for the truth to catch up to everyone else. It usually does. It just needs a little more patience than you think you have left. If this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to share it, and I'd love even more to hear yours in the comments. The moment someone misjudged you, and how you finally got the chance to be seen for who you actually were.